Hey guys, I know some of you wanted to know my top 10 films of 2012, but after a few false starts, I really don't think I could offer a list of substance this year. A number of factors kept me away from a lot of movies I would have otherwise seen. I was unemployed for 6 months right in the middle of the year and couldn't afford to be watching films, and even with the job I have now, I wouldn't be doing this show if this new MoviePass thing didn't make films so affordable. And then there's the fact that the only theaters in reasonable driving distance are multiplexes, so there's a great number of smaller films that would have probably have ended up on a top 10 list had I had a chance to see them. As such, I didn't get a chance to see Paranorman, Moonrise Kingdom, The Master, Holy Motors, Frankenweenie, Argo, The Three Stooges, 21 Jump Street, Bernie, Ted, Flight, Safety Not Guaranteed, The Grey, The American Scream, Cosmopolis, 444, The Last Day on Earth, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, Beast of the Southern Wild, or Paul Williams Still Alive. But I will still give you guys a list, presented alphabetically. While not every one of these films are perfect, they are the 10 most interesting and fun films I saw in 2012. They are The Avengers, Cabin in the Woods, Cloud Atlas, Django Unchained, End of Watch, Jack Reacher, Looper, The Raid Redemption, Skyfall, and Wreck-It Ralph. Every one of them is worth watching. And now, on to 2013. This is another film where I had no option but to see it in 3D, but a horror 3D experience is very different from something like Circus Olay Worlds Away. 3D horror is mostly stuff with only the slightest bit of depth perception, to the point that you wonder why they bothered to present it in 3D at all, punctuated with moments of chainsaws and fingers and blood getting thrown in your face. Yes, we haven't progressed this format since Friday the 13th Part 3, or even since 1953 with the Vincent Price version of House of Wax. There's a scene in that film where a guy just shoves a paddle ball in your face for 3 minutes. It's pretty stupid. Anyway, as I mentioned before, I'm not a huge horror guy outside of a few select franchises. I have seen the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, and I've read the Wikipedia articles and watched the obscurest Looper reviews of the sequels, prequels, remakes, and what have you. It's kind of interesting, the way the sequels don't acknowledge each other, and then you have this new sequel to the original film that very specifically makes the previous sequels not even close to canon, and damn, this shit's more complicated than the Zelda timeline. The only reasonable conclusion to all of this is a Turtles Forever style team-up of every version of Leatherface. This film opens immediately after the ending of the first, with a shootout at the Sawyer farmhouse that kills everyone except Leatherface and a baby. We then cut to present day, where the baby Heather is now 38 years old, played by 26-year-old Alexandra Daddario, who, a lot has been made about the timelines that don't match, unless the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre took place in the early 90s. I myself was hoping for a 90s period piece, but in all fairness, the timeline thing isn't really all that worth getting caught up in. Not when the rest of the film is pretty much shit. This film is pretty much the perfect example of what I hate about modern slasher horror. The collection of young, disposable, annoying non-characters who drink and play pool and have sex as to justify their inevitable murders, increasingly ridiculous set pieces in an attempt to top previous death scenes, fake out jump scares, and just all around we're not gonna try screenwriting. About the most interesting thing about the film is an attempt in the final act to pull a switcheroo that shows Leatherface, the giant serial killer who has already killed 4 people, not counting the victims of the first film, as sympathetic, and it doesn't really pull it off. If you want to see that idea done well, go watch Rob Zombie's The Devil's Rejects. It's most telling that there wasn't a single startle, not a single scream or whimper in the audience when I saw this, and I was in a packed theater that night. No, the only sound I heard was laughter. Laughing at the cornball dialogue, laughing at each over-the-top death. They could sense just how little anyone involved in this production cared about the final product and sought their enjoyment from the cheapness. This might make a good riff track someday, but there really is no real reason to see it. It's not a serious attempt at horror or a serious attempt at horror camp. It's not even serious as a film, period. Skip this one with a vengeance. And yet, it wasn't the worst film I saw this week. did I just watch? As of this writing, it really seems like this film totally bombed. It's already gone from my local theater, and good riddance. I really, really hated this film. What we have here is a 1960s period piece about an American garage cover band during the British invasion and the Summer of Love. Okay, fine. Not the first film to approach the period from the point of view of popular music, but if you get some strong writing and a nice artistic vision, you can do interesting things with it. It's too bad that this film feels like That Thing You Do if written by Tommy Wiseau. I'm not being facetious. This film has a lot of the shit we call Tommy Wiseau out for in The Room. First, the asinine dialogue. Characters are constantly changing subject at a turn of a hat, making it difficult to follow conversations. And some of these non-sequiturs are so non-sequitory that they'll make you spit milk out your nose even if you're not drinking milk. There is seriously a moment where one girl tells this guy that, and I'm not making this up, she has seen her sister poop. I'd love to give you context for this line. I'd really, really love to, but I can't. I'm so sorry, but I can't. Also like a goddamn Tommy Wiseau film is the utter contempt the film has for secondary characters. It's completely impossible to keep track of them. They come and go and never properly introduce themselves, and you have no idea which of them are actually important or not. Characters that you follow for half the film suddenly vanish, and then new characters pop up near the end, and the film pretends we should know who they are and why they're important. Not to mention that all the characters that actually stick around for the entire film are all self-absorbed assholes, and there's no one to root for in this flick. Oh, and the most on-the-nose way that this is like a Tommy Wiseau film? There's a goddamn cancer subplot that goes nowhere. The character doesn't die, doesn't get sick or weak, and there are a few what will happen when I'm gone discussions which don't matter because the character never goes. But you know what? Maybe we haven't been giving Tommy Wiseau enough credit. For all you can say about The Room, at least it had a plot. This film has absolutely no cohesion, no story or character arc or anything to bring these elements together. The entire film is just scenes floating around in the vacuum of space. You could seriously reshuffle the entire film, and I wouldn't know it was supposed to be that way. And all capped with this out-of-nowhere, fourth-wall-breaking ending that felt like a direct insult to the audience. I haven't been this confused by a film in years. Scenes seem to jump forward randomly in time, I think over the span of 5 years, and I only know that because I have some vague understanding of rock and political history in the 60s. On that note, this is the worst kind of period piece, the kind that turns history into a kind of theme park or carnival show. Step right up and see the Kennedy assassination. Feast your eyes upon the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. 25 cents, people, step right up. Yeah, it's all the well-known events of the 60s without really exploring what those events meant to people then, or mean to people now. This is the kind of film where a character goes, "So, what about that Martin Luther King, huh?" Yeah, on top of the film being poorly written and badly edited, it's fucking lazy. This is not hyperbole. I have far more respect for what Tommy Wiseau was doing in The Room than what's going on here. And you wouldn't think that possible with the people involved. The film is written and directed by David Chase, the man behind The Sopranos, a show that, well, honestly, I haven't seen a single episode of, and right now I think I'm going to keep it that way, but a lot of people like that show, so what do I know? Speaking of The Sopranos, James Gandolfini is in this, and between this and Killing Them Softly, I'm beginning to realize that he's not really that great of an actor. This movie is bad. Bad. At least Texas Chainsaw 3D had a plot. At least it could keep track of its characters. At least they attempted to make a few sympathetic characters that said things that made sense in your story. When a stupid horror cash-in film is more competently put together than yours, you really need to step back and rethink your career. I'm glad this movie bombed. It couldn't have happened to a bigger piece of shit. Gus Van Sant. You've certainly had a unique film career. Sometimes you're making excellent dramas, sometimes not so excellent dramas. Sometimes you're making a movie about Uma Thurman having big thumbs, and sometimes you're doing a scene-by-scene remake of Psycho. And sometimes you have Matt Damon and Casey Affleck walking around the desert for 100 minutes. A Gus Van Sant film is like a box of chocolate. You never know what you're going to get. And this time, hey, who put a boring Snickers bar in my box of chocolate? Promised Land is not a bad movie, but it's a small and actually mostly uninteresting movie. Matt Damon plays Steve Butler, a man who works for a natural gas company called Global. His job is to go into small towns and have them sign off on mineral rights releases. However, this time he's struggling. His efforts to buy out a small Pennsylvania town is hindered by a local science teacher, played by Hal Holbrook, and a road-tripping environmentalist, played by John Krasinski. I really want to give this film so many props for presenting the issues it raises as more complex, not so black and white as they're traditionally presented. Global isn't some evil, cackling corporation. They are a genuine company that, yes, is out to make a profit, but isn't looking to screw people over to do it. Matt Damon's character truly believes he's helping these small-town people in this bad economy. He's witnessed the economic destruction of small-town America firsthand and wants to prevent that. But he's not a white knight either. He lies to people to maximize profits. The people in the town are a mix of those who really want Global to come to their town, both for totally selfish reasons, thinking they're going to get rich, or totally unselfish ones, like caring for their children, and people who don't want Global to come over, both out of fear of what fracking for natural gas might do to the local environment and livestock, and out of a stupid sense of small town America, fuck yeah, my grandpa built this barn bullshit. Hal Holbrook's character doesn't see Global as the enemy as much as he sees the town's greed and stupidity as the enemy, and fights on that front, while John Krasinski's character might have a few points backed with evidence, but he's also a manipulative douchebag. I really like this. You know me, I prefer my moral quandaries with shades of gray. Issues like this are complicated, and nobody here seems entirely right or entirely wrong, but everyone seems like they're doing it for what they believe to be the right reasons. I was actually getting excited. I was expecting a more pat black and white environmentalist film, and was instead getting something that didn't actually seem like it was biased for one side or the other. Something that was a lot more true to life than you expect at a local movie theater. And then it all went wrong. There's a twist in the final act. I won't reveal it here, but I honestly didn't see it coming, and it really surprised me. However, it also completely invalidated everything that had come before it. Global actually is an evil cackling corporation after all. Natural gas actually is pretty awful. And Matt Damon is a total patsy who suddenly has a change of heart and gives the big speech at the end that saves the town from big bad Global. All that goodwill the film was building up suddenly and violently chucked out the window for a much more conventional and infinitely less interesting conclusion. Gag me with a spoon. That's really too bad. The film is very well shot and acted, though a few of the characters seem a bit unneeded. I didn't mention Frances McDormand or Rosemary DeWitt because they're only really there to serve Matt Damon's character arc, to be a person for Damon to play off of, and to be a love interest, respectively. Not a lot of material for them to work with, but they still do a good job. In the end, the unbalanced script and weak ending do the film a disservice. If you've seen all the recent great films and need a halfway decent one to fill a few hours, you could do worse than Promised Land. Just don't feel compelled to own it on DVD afterwards. Well, after a stupid slasher film, a pile of crap, and what could have been a great film had it not chickened out on its own ending, it's nice to see a movie that I can't come up with any major complaints for. If we really wanted to go film school and nitpick over it, I can make a few cases on where the pacing could have been tightened and how a few shots come off weird, but this is an experience film, a feeling film, one aiming to replicate the punch in the gut of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and the high emotions of characters trying to piece their lives back together. Any kind of technical breakdown would be missing the point. The film does not play with subtlety. It is very in-your-face about this disaster and its physical effects on people. There's some pretty graphic moments that made my stomach curl up in protest to what I was seeing. Some seriously great makeup as characters get more and more injured and sick. The acting in this film is pretty amazing. You get all the feels blasted into your face as Naomi Watts and Ewan McGregor just break down as their worlds crumble around them. Tom Holland is a great new young actor who carries about half the film by himself. I predict this kid is going to go places. And really, there's not much to say beyond it's a wonderfully sad and heartfelt emotional experience. I teared up a few times. I was a bit disappointed that the film is more or less spoiled by the trailer, but if you really think about it, the title kind of spoils what's going to happen to these people, and you might already know what's going on since it's based on a true story anyway. This is the film of the week for me, a truly visceral experience that doesn't fall into the traps of outright manipulation that often comes with this territory. Of course, all films are manipulative to a degree, they wouldn't work if they weren't, but films like this can be so blatant in it, and thankfully this one is classy and real enough that you don't feel even remotely cheated. The Impossible was great, and probably the film you want to start 2013 with. July 28th, 1982. Over 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan is president. Eye of the Tiger by Survivor is the US's #1 single. The first computer virus is written. T.J. Hooker's on TV. The Equal Rights Amendment fails to pass in Congress. Dig Dug hits arcades, and one of the big films to enter popular culture, of which there were many that year, was An Officer and a Gentleman, starring Richard Gere, Deborah Winger, Louis Gossett Jr., and David Keith, and directed by Taylor Hackford, whose new film Parker is going to be in theaters in just a couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see how much his style has changed over 30 years. An Officer and a Gentleman is probably the biggest film of 1982 that I had not yet seen, though I already knew a bit about it through multiple parodies and hearing the movie's theme song, Up Where We Belong, over and over again. All of which suggested a much broader and far less subtle film than it actually is. Up Where We Belong is kind of an awful love song, and the scenes this film is often mocked for, such as the ending or the "I got nowhere else to go" line delivery, are really punctuations to a much more quiet and nuanced story than it often gets credit for. The plot, if you're unfamiliar, has Zach Mayo, played by Richard Gere, joining the Navy to get away from his alcoholic father and become a pilot. The film covers his 13 weeks in officer training, instructed by hard-as-nails Sergeant Foley, played by Louis Gossett Jr., and falling in love with local girl Paula, played by Deborah Winger. Interestingly, the romance half of this film is the better half. The way Paula brings Mayo out of his introverted habits. Mayo got it all bottled up inside character. And we learn enough about him early on to prevent this from making him some kind of silent badass character. Their relationship works, but it's no picnic. Between Mayo's fear of commitment, the general hostile attitude around him concerning the Navy boot camp and the town built around it, and the two scoops of gender politics. Some really interesting gender politics too. I won't get too much into it, but the film presents a few harsh truths about some people of certain genders, not all mind you, but some, that you really couldn't say today without getting called a sexist pig. Gender politics, another thing along with slavery I really shouldn't be expressing my opinions on in my YouTube channel. The officer training stuff seems like an entirely other movie though. Foley is kind of an over-the-top character on paper, though Gossett does an amazing job of tempering the character and giving him more depth. Actually, my gut instinct was to call his character a ripoff of Lee Emery's character from Full Metal Jacket, even stealing a few lines directly, only then to remember that Full Metal Jacket came out 5 years after this film. Then I learned Lee Emery actually trained Gossett in drill instructing, and it all came full circle. This is still a character arc that ends in a kung fu fight, though. I wouldn't go so far as to call this film one of the greats. It does get really silly at times, but I was pleasantly surprised by how complex and interesting it was, and how affecting it could be. There are some really tragic moments, and some really tender ones too. I'm happy to say we kicked off the 82 Rewind with a good start. See you next week.